February 1944. Deep inside Germany, the sky above Leipzig is alive with thunder. Sirens wail across the city as the first black dots appear on the horizon. Hundreds of them, shimmering silver against the pale winter sun. Within minutes, the horizon becomes a moving wall of metal. B-17 flying fortresses, the American bombers that never seem to end. German soldiers sprint to their flak batteries. Commanders shout coordinates over radios. The sky fills with black bursts as the first rounds explode, thunderous blossoms of shrapnel cutting through the air. But still, they come. Wave after wave of bombers push forward. Steady, unbroken, engines droning in perfect formation. The sound is deafening. A mechanical heartbeat of an empire halfway across the ocean. In bunkers below, German civilians tremble as the ground shakes. Gunners reload, aim, and fire again. The sky is a storm. Fire, smoke, twisted metal. Yet the formation barely wavers. A German officer lowers his binoculars, speechless. How? How can they still be coming? Overhead, the B-17's tighten formation. Heavy, wounded, but unyielding. To the Germans watching below, it feels less like an attack, and more like inevitability itself. In 1942, the war in Europe had reached a brutal stalemate. Germany's armies occupied most of the continent, its factories producing tanks, ammunition, and aircraft in endless numbers. To strike at the heart of that machine, the Allies needed more than courage. They needed reach. The answer came in the form of a four-engine bomber built for endurance, precision, and survival. The B-17 Flying Fortress. When the U.S. 8th Air Force arrived in England that year, it carried with it a bold, untested doctrine: daylight precision bombing. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of striking at night, as the British Royal Air Force did, the Americans would bomb during the day, using high-altitude accuracy to destroy factories, railways, and oil plants while minimizing civilian casualties. It sounded moral, efficient, and almost impossible. The German Reich had prepared for this moment. Around its major industrial centers, Hamburg, Essen, Cologne, Schweinfurt, and Berlin, stood the densest air defense network in history. Thousands of Flak 88mm guns, radar-directed spotlights, and heavy batteries waited on rooftops, field, and city outskirts. Each weapon could hurl shells exploding at 20,000 feet, filling the air with molten steel. At first, American commanders underestimated what awaited them. Early raids in late 1942 seemed successful. B-17s hit railway yards in France and shipyards along the North Sea with manageable losses. Crews joked that their aircraft really were flying fortresses, but the deeper they pushed into Germany, the more that illusion cracked. The German defenses adapted quickly. Fighter squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s waited at the edges of radar coverage, ready to tear apart formations. Between attacks came the flak, waves of black explosions that turned the daylight sky into a furnace. Crews described it as flying through a storm of iron. Still, the Americans pressed forward. They were fighting not just for victory, but for proof that strategic bombing could win a modern war. General Ira C. Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, believed it could break Germany's industrial backbone without the need for another blood-soaked ground invasion. But the price was staggering. In 1943 alone, nearly 1 in 5 bomber crews failed to return from missions. Entire squadrons disappeared over the Ruhr Valley and the skies of Bremen. Survivors spoke of planes shredded mid-air, engines aflame, comrades bailing out over enemy territory. Yet even in defeat, the lesson was clear. The enemy was afraid. From the ground, German civilians and soldiers alike saw something terrifying. A nation thousands of miles away could fill their skies with machines faster than they could shoot them down. The flak worked, the fighters worked, but the bombers always came back. That realization that the sky itself had turned against them was the beginning of Germany's greatest fear, and the Americans were just getting started. By the spring of 1943. The American air offensive had entered a new and merciless phase. What began as small experimental raids had turned into massive daylight formations stretching for miles across the European sky. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators thundered eastward from airfields in England, bound for the industrial heart of the Reich. Each mission was a feat of coordination and courage. Pilots climbed through layers of fog and ice, assembling into precise combat boxes that looked from below like a metallic cloud. Once the course was set, they flew straight. No evasive maneuvers, no weaving, trusting the formation's firepower to protect them. Every aircraft carried 10 men, 10 lives balanced between discipline and chance. The Germans called it Terrorflieger, the Terror Flyers. To them, the sight was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. Civilians stared upward as the sunlight glinted off hundreds of silver wings, a mechanical storm advancing without fear. Air raid sirens wailed, and flak towers opened fire, shaking the cities beneath. At the center of this duel stood the 88mm flak gun, Germany's most feared anti-aircraft weapon. It could throw a 20-pound shell over 5 miles into the air, each burst scattering hundreds of steel fragments across the sky. Radar and optical rangefinders guided the batteries, and entire neighborhoods became part of the defense network. Schoolboys loaded ammunition, women tracked targets from rooftops, and veterans commanded the gun. By 1944, over 1 million Germans worked in flak operations. The Americans knew the odds. They called the target zones flak alleys. Inside a bomber, the noise was indescribable. The metallic thunder of engines, the dull boom of shells, and the sharp clang of fragments striking the fuselage. Crews watched through plexiglass windows as nearby planes vanished in fireballs, yet orders demanded they hold formation. Turning away meant isolation and certain death. The Luftwaffe, too, joined the onslaught. Fighters slashed through the bomber streams in coordinated attacks, sometimes head-on, using 20mm cannons to tear apart engines and cockpits. But every week the Americans came again. The relentless rhythm of raids began to wear down not just Germany's factories but its faith. General Eaker's 8th Air Force called it the Long War of Endurance. Each mission was a test of will, machines against men, production against destruction. The Allies were gambling that industrial power could outlast human fear, and for Germany, that gamble was terrifyingly real. Even as cities burned and defenses thickened, the bomber streams grew larger. When one group was shot down, replacements arrived within days. Newer aircraft, fresher crews, endless resolve. By mid-1943, whispers spread among German civilians and soldiers alike. The Americans will not stop. The sky had become a factory of its own, one that produced death, noise, and inevitability. Soon, both sides would collide in some of the most brutal air battles ever fought, where courage, technology, and terror would define the limits of human endurance. The human angle. Inside the flying fortress at 25,000 feet, the world looked calm, white clouds stretching forever. But inside a B-17, there was no calm, only noise and fear. 10 men sealed in a vibrating shell of aluminum and steel, breathing through oxygen masks that froze against their faces. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. A single flak fragment could punch through the fuselage and slice through a man before anyone noticed. Each mission lasted up to 8 hours. The bomber crews called them milk runs with grim irony. Every man knew the odds. Survive 25 missions and you could go home. Few did. The average crew life expectancy over Germany in 1943 was just 6 sorties. From the cockpit, the pilot stared into blinding sun and smoke. Behind him, the navigator and bombardier worked under pressure, guiding the formation to its target. Gunners, packed into tiny turrets, scanned the skies for German fighters. Over intercom, voices were flat, mechanical, as if emotion had to be buried to survive. Flak bursts appeared as black clouds, each one a deadly bloom. The air shook. Every explosion meant hundreds of razor-sharp fragments, each capable of tearing through fuel lines or flesh. The gunner's hands were numb. The flight engineer wiped frost from his instrument. Some prayed, others cursed, but no one turned back. They watched nearby planes explode or spiral downward, parachutes opening like dandelions. The formation closed ranks around the missing, discipline replacing grief. The goal was always the same: stay level, hold course, drop the bombs, and bring the fortress home. When the mission was over, the men would return to base, exhausted, shaking, faces black with soot and gunpowder. The ground crew would count the holes in the fuselage, sometimes hundreds. Medics carried away the wounded or zipped the dead into canvas bags. And by dawn, new crews were already boarding fresh aircraft, ready to fly the same path through the same fire. For the Americans, it was more than strategy. It was a test of endurance, a belief that courage, multiplied by thousands, could wear down even the strongest enemy. The German angle, the defenders in the firestorm, to the Germans below. The bombing campaign felt endless, a punishment that no weapon could stop. Flak batteries surrounded every major city, their barrels pointed skyward day and night. The defenders worked in 12-hour shifts, freezing in winter, sweating in summer, their ears ringing from the roar of the guns. For many of them, it was their only war, never seeing the enemy up close, only glimpsing distant silver specks before the sky erupted. Every raid began the same way: air raid sirens, radar alerts, and the deep rhythmic pounding of artillery. Gun crews loaded shell after shell, guided by officers shouting range and elevation. Each explosion filled the air with black smoke and steel. But no matter how much fire they threw into the sky, the formations never seemed to break. German soldiers began to speak of the bombers as a metal plague, an unstoppable force that returned every day, no matter how many were shot down. In some cities, morale broke. Civilians fled shelters in panic, convinced that nothing could defeat the endless streams of American aircraft. Even the Luftwaffe's best pilots grew disillusioned. One ace recalled watching entire squadrons of B-17s emerge from the smoke after direct hits. "We fired everything we had, and still they came." It was like fighting a machine that felt no fear. On the ground, flak crews lived with dread. When a bomber exploded, they cheered. But moments later, another wave appeared. For every wreck that fell, 100 engines still droned overhead. The endless thunder of the raids destroyed not only buildings, but hope. To many Germans, the air war became a nightmare with no escape, a storm that returned every morning with mechanical precision. The leadership angle, strategy, sacrifice, and stubborn faith in London and Washington. The architects of the bombing campaign faced a brutal equation: destruction versus endurance. Generals Ira C. Eaker and Karl Spath believed daylight precision bombing could shorten the war if America could sustain the losses. They were aware of the cost. Reports from England listed entire groups wiped out in single missions. But the industrial might of the United States meant replacements kept arriving. New planes, new crews, new fuel. Eaker famously told his men, "We must never let the enemy believe we can be stopped." Behind that calm determination lay an immense logistical machine. Factories in Seattle, Wichita, and Long Beach produced B-17s at a rate of one every hour. Training schools turned civilians into airmen in months. The system didn't rely on survival. It relied on replacement. The Germans couldn't match it. For every anti-aircraft gun built, America produced 5 new bombers. For every Luftwaffe pilot lost, the Allies trained 10. It was industrial war, relentless, mathematical, and impersonal. Eaker and Spaatz argued that each raid, no matter how costly, drained Germany's reserves of oil, steel, and morale. It was a war of exhaustion, one that the United States could afford and Germany could not. To the men flying those missions, that logic offered little comfort. They didn't see strategy. They saw fire, debris, and death. But in the long view of history, that endurance, those endless waves of B-17s, would break the backbone of the Reich. The technological angle, the fortress that refused to die, the B-17. Flying Fortress was more than a bomber. It was an engineering statement. Designed in the 1930s by Boeing, it embodied a new philosophy: survival through structure. Its aluminum frame was overbuilt, its systems redundant, its armor carefully placed to protect the crew's most vital positions. A single flak burst might rip away part of the tail, shatter a wing surface, or puncture fuel tanks, but the plane would still fly. Pilots often returned to base with half their control surfaces gone, engines flaming, and fuselages riddled with holes. Ground crews joked that a B-17 could fly home on faith alone. The aircraft's self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy armor plating, and compartmentalized design made it one of the toughest machines of the war. Many fortresses came back on 2 engines, sometimes 1. The British Lancaster could carry more bombs. The B-24 could fly farther. But nothing took punishment like the B-17. Its nickname, Flying Fortress, wasn't propaganda. It was experience. Each bomber carried up to 13 50-caliber Browning machine guns arranged across waist, tail, and dorsal turrets. When formations flew tight, their overlapping fields of fire created a wall of lead. Enemy fighters approaching head-on often found themselves shredded before closing in. For the Germans, this resilience was maddening. They built heavier cannons, improved their ammunition, and even developed air-to-air rockets. But the results barely changed. The bombers burned, yes, but they didn't stop. The fortress had become a symbol of American persistence. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was the physical embodiment of the industrial strength behind it. For every one shot down, another rolled out of a factory hangar in Kansas the next day. No matter how much steel Germany poured into the sky, the B-17 refused to die. The tactical angle, formations, escorts, and firepower success in the air war wasn't just about machines, it was about method. The U.S. Army Air Forces turned bombing into choreography. B-17s didn't fly alone. They flew in compact formations called combat boxes, stacked vertically and horizontally for mutual defense. The design maximized visibility and fire coverage. Each bomber protected the other's blind spots, transforming hundreds of planes into one giant fortress in the sky. It was a system born of necessity. Individual aircraft couldn't survive the concentrated attacks of Luftwaffe fighters, but when they flew together, their combined firepower was devastating. German pilots called these formations Fliegende Igel, flying hedgehogs. Still, the bombers needed help. In 1943, their range exceeded that of their escorts. The result was tragedy. Missions deep into Germany without fighter protection led to catastrophic losses at Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Dozens of bombers fell to enemy fire. Crews called the missions one-way trips. That changed in 1944 with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. With long-range fuel tanks, these sleek American fighters could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The balance shifted overnight. German interceptors, already short on fuel and pilots, now faced swarms of Mustangs waiting to pounce. Combined with radar navigation and improved coordination, the bombing campaign became unstoppable. By mid-1944, American formations crossed the Rhine almost daily. Even in the face of massive flak, discipline held. Turning back was no longer an option, not for individual aircraft, not for the campaign itself. Germany was now fighting a war it could no longer see or stop. A war waged by precision, rhythm, and relentless numbers. The moral and psychological angle. The machine versus the mind for the Germans. The endless arrival of American bombers was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological collapse. Every raid carried a message. No matter what you build, we can destroy it. No matter how many we lose, we will return tomorrow. Civilians and soldiers alike began to view the sky with dread. The black smoke of flak batteries became part of everyday life, their thunder echoing over cities day and night. For American airmen, the moral burden was heavy. They were told their missions targeted factories, not civilians. But from 20,000 feet, the difference was impossible to see. Smoke and fire consumed entire neighborhoods. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden became infernos. The bomber crews didn't celebrate. They endured. Most simply wanted the war to end. The flak, the losses, the endless repetition, it created a strange duality. Above, young Americans risked everything for victory. Below, German citizens cowered in basements, terrified of an enemy they could not reach. Historians would later debate the morality of the bombing campaign. Was it justified? Was it necessary? The answer remained complex. But in the eyes of those who lived through it, the sight of the B-17, that kept coming became the defining image of inevitability. The moment when Germany realized that courage and faith could not outlast the machine. It was not just the fall of a nation, but the triumph of a new kind of warfare, one powered not by emotion, but by endurance. August 17, 1943. Before dawn, the airfields of eastern England were already roaring with engines. Crews climbed aboard their flying fortresses, oxygen masks slung around their necks, flak vests heavy across their chests. Mechanics gave final thumbs up as more than 370 B-17s began to lift into the gray sky. Their targets, the twin industrial cities of Regensburg and Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany, the very heart of its aircraft production and ball-bearing manufacturing. It would become one of the most punishing air raids of the entire war. The mission plan was ambitious. One wave would strike the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg, crippling fighter production. The second would hit the Schweinfurt ball-bearing works, cutting off a vital artery of the German war machine. But the routes stretched hundreds of miles beyond escort range. The men knew what that meant. For most of the journey, they would be alone. As the first formations crossed the channel, sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off hundreds of silver wings. German radar detected them almost immediately. Sirens wailed across Bavaria. Fighter bases scrambled every available Bf-109 and FW-190. Then the Flak began. Over the Ruhr, black bursts tore the sky apart. The air shook violently. Shells detonated in every direction. Crews described it as flying through a wall of exploding smoke. Fragments ripped into fuselages, punching holes wide enough to crawl through. Yet the formation held. By the time they reached Regensburg, dozens of aircraft were already lost. Bombers burned, spiraling down in flames. But the survivors pressed on, dropping their payloads with grim precision. Massive explosions rippled through the Messerschmitt complex. Hangars, assembly lines, fuel depots all consumed in seconds. The returning wave met fresh waves of German fighters. Ammunition belts ran empty. Gunners' barrels glowed red-hot. Inside each plane, the smell of cordite and sweat mixed with the cold stench of fear. Over Schweinfurt, the second wave endured the same hell. Flak bursts so dense that crews said they could have walked across the smoke. By the time the last group turned for home, 60 bombers were gone, and over 550 airmen were dead, missing, or captured. It was the highest single-day loss the 8th Air Force had ever suffered. And yet, the Germans were horrified. Even after such devastation, even after hundreds of tons of ammunition and the full fury of the Luftwaffe, the bombers still came. The sky over Germany that day never cleared. Formation after formation kept rolling in. Factories lay in ruins, and the Reich's confidence shattered. General Galland, Germany's top fighter ace, later admitted, "We thought we had stopped them." But the next week, they returned. It was then we knew this war could not be won. The Americans had proven their point. They could reach anywhere, at any cost, and in the months that followed, the cost would climb even higher. But so would the realization that nothing, not even the most concentrated air defense in history, could halt the advance of the Flying Fortress. By 1944, Germany's cities had become fortresses, not of safety, but of defense. The skyline of every major industrial center bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Concrete flak towers loomed over Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, their massive barrels ready to tear the sky apart. Searchlights pierced the night, and radar stations along the coast tracked incoming raids. The Luftwaffe, though bloodied, was still feared, and yet it no longer mattered, because now the Americans came in numbers so vast that even the most disciplined gun crews lost count. Entire squadrons of B-17s and B-24s filled the daylight skies, their contrails forming white rivers across the blue. They flew so high and in such density that German civilians began calling them Die Wolkenfabrik, the cloud factory. Below, the ground trembled from the synchronized rhythm of engines, a sound that carried for miles. When the first radar blips appeared on German screens, officers issued familiar orders: man the flak batteries, scramble interceptor, clear the shelters. But what followed was no longer a battle. It was an avalanche. At Munich, Leipzig, Berlin, and Dresden, anti-aircraft guns unleashed continuous fire for hours. The sky turned black with smoke and shrapnel. The air smelled of cordite, metal, and burning oil. Still, the formations moved forward, unbroken. Each bomber released its payload with calm precision, guided by the Norden bombsight, a mechanical marvel that could hit a target from 5 miles up. The Germans adapted, improving radar-directed flak and introducing deadly jet interceptors like the Me-262. But even these breakthroughs came too late. The jets could only make 1 or 2 passes before fuel ran out, and by 1945, the Luftwaffe's veteran pilots were gone, replaced by boys barely trained to fly. From the ground, the scenes defied reason. Witnesses described silver curtains of bombers stretching from horizon to horizon, immune to fear, indifferent to death. Every time a formation disappeared into smoke, another followed behind it. One German gunner recalled after the war, "It was like fighting the ocean. You could shoot into it all day, but the waves never stopped." Inside the bunkers of Berlin, senior officers faced the grim truth. Reports showed thousands of anti-aircraft shells fired for every bomber destroyed. The resources poured into Flak, steel, labor, fuel, had become a black hole of effort, with diminishing return. Factories were reduced to rubble faster than they could rebuild. By late 1944, Germany's air defense system existed in form, but not in function. Ammunition was scarce, radar operators exhausted, communication lines broken. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a symbol of inevitability. When the Allied bombers appeared, people no longer ran for cover in panic. They simply watched, in silence. The thunder was too familiar, too constant. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared upward, numb, as the great metal formations glided through the flak, untouched, unending, unstoppable. It was more than destruction. It was domination through endurance. The Americans had done what no enemy in history had achieved. They conquered the air over Germany not by surprise, but by sheer persistence. For those on the ground, the message was unmistakable. The sky itself now belonged to the enemy. By the beginning of 1945, Germany's sky, once a symbol of national pride and technological mastery, had turned into a corridor of defeat. The constant rumble of bombers had become the pulse of a dying empire. Cities that had defined German industry, Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, Berlin, now lay in ruin. Smoke clouds rose so high they merged with the clouds. The U.S. 8th Air Force, once an experiment, had become a machine of relentless precision. What had started with a few hundred bombers in 1942 was now a fleet of thousands. Every morning, the roar of engines over East Anglia signaled another day of destruction for the Reich. Germany's famed industries were collapsing. The synthetic oil plants that powered tanks and aircraft were reduced to rubble by repeated raids. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe was paralyzed. Even the panzer divisions, once the terror of Europe, could no longer move. Train yards and rail bridges were hit so frequently that logistics, the very lifeline of war, disintegrated. In Berlin, the air defense reports grew desperate. Ammunition stocks for the flak guns were running out. Radar units were silent from lack of parts, and thousands of gun crews had been redirected to fight on the collapsing Eastern Front. What remained were exhausted men firing blindly into a sky filled with enemy aircraft. The psychological toll was beyond measure. For the average German citizen, the drone of bombers became as familiar as the ticking of a clock. Shelters overflowed, hospitals were destroyed, and food convoys were cut off. Children drew pictures of bombers in their schoolbook. The war was no longer distant. It lived above them. Inside the bunkers of the German High Command, arguments erupted daily. Some officers demanded the development of miracle weapons to turn the tide. Others begged for surrender. But the reality was inescapable. The skies were lost, and with them, the war. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Channel, American morale had hardened into grim confidence. Crews no longer asked if they would reach their targets, but how many would make it back. Each mission was part of a greater rhythm, a system of endurance that outpaced fear. Replacement planes, crews, and ammunition arrived faster than Germany could destroy them. By early 1945, The flak guns that once inspired terror had become symbols of futility. Even when they scored hits, they could not stem the tide. The world had entered a new reality. Wars would no longer be won by land alone. The battlefield had moved upward to the skies, and Germany, the once proud pioneer of modern warfare, had lost control of it completely. The air war had not just crippled production, it had shattered faith. Factories could be rebuilt, railroads could be repaired. But once a nation believed the sky itself was against them, the war, in truth, was already over. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the once mighty Third Reich lay in fragments. From the smoking ruins of Hamburg to the shattered streets of Berlin, the price of total war was written in stone and ash, and above it all hung a memory that every German, soldier or civilian, carried: the endless drone of American bombers that had filled their skies, day after day, month after month, until hope itself seemed to collapse beneath the sound. In the years that followed, even German commanders admitted that the relentless U.S. air campaign had been the beginning of the end. General Adolf Galland, who had once led the Luftwaffe's fighter defense, called it a battle against mathematics. No matter how many planes they shot down, more came. No matter how accurate their flak fire, the bombers replaced the fallen within days. He later wrote, "The war in the air was lost when we realized that the Americans could build faster than we could destroy." Inside post-war interrogations, captured officers described the psychological devastation caused by the bombing campaign. Flak crews spoke of sleepless nights, trembling hands, and numb exhaustion. The very men who had fired the 88s admitted that each new wave of B-17s made them feel smaller, weaker, powerless against a machine that never stopped. For the civilians who endured the air raids, the experience was both trauma and revelation. Many remembered standing in cellars as the bombs fell, counting the seconds between explosions, wondering how the sky could hold so many planes. When the raids ended, they would emerge to find entire streets erased. Some survivors described their fear turning into resignation. "We stopped hating the bombers," one woman recalled. "We only waited for them to come back." The Allies, too, reflected on the cost. More than 26,000 American airmen of the 8th Air Force were killed, a toll greater than the entire U.S. Marine Corps suffered in the Pacific. But their endurance, their willingness to fly through fire again and again, had broken the German war machine in a way no invasion could. By late 1945, Allied studies showed that German oil output had fallen by over 90%, rail transport by 70%, and fighter production by half. The flak defenses, once a symbol of technological pride, were silent hulks rusting among the ruins. Historians later agreed the B-17 campaign didn't just destroy factories, it destroyed the illusion of invincibility. The Third Reich had boasted of eternal strength, of skies it would rule forever. The bombers proved otherwise. When post-war Germany rebuilt, the memory of those raids haunted every generation that followed. For them, the sound of distant engines was more than a reminder of defeat. It was the echo of a lesson learned at unimaginable cost, that no fortress, no ideology, no army could outlast a nation willing to endure the impossible. The B-17 crews never claimed to be heroes. Most simply said they were doing their duty. But to those who lived beneath their contrails, they were the embodiment of inevitability, proof that America's will to fight had become a force of nature. The war in the air ended with surrender on the ground, and for Germany, that surrender began the moment they looked up and realized the bombers were still coming. In every war, there comes a moment when courage meets something greater than courage: persistence. For the men who flew the B-17s, the skies over Germany were not just a battlefield. They were a test of endurance, of belief, of how long a nation could keep sending its sons into fire for an idea that had to outlast fear. For those on the ground, it felt like the end of the world. To German soldiers and civilians alike, the bombers seemed endless, a mechanical storm born from across the ocean. No propaganda could explain it. No weapon could stop it. The endless sound of engines became a kind of truth, that the Reich was no longer master of its fate. In that relentless rhythm, formation after formation, mission after mission, lay the real power of the Allied air campaign. It was not only steel and fuel that defeated Germany, it was will, the quiet, disciplined, mathematical will to keep coming, no matter the cost. Every burst of flak, every burning plane, every fallen crewman carried the same message back to Berlin. You can destroy the machine, but not the system that built it. The B-17 was not the most beautiful or the fastest aircraft of the war, but it became a symbol of something larger, of democracy's ability to turn unity and industry into endurance. It represented the moment when modern war stopped being decided by who struck hardest, and began being decided by who refused to stop. When peace finally came, the skies over Europe were silent again. The same cities that once shook with explosions now echoed with rebuilding. But the memory of those silver formations never faded. For the Germans, it was the sound of inevitability. For the Americans, it was the sound of duty fulfilled. For history, it was the sound of a new age, when courage became machinery, and machinery became the expression of human determination. And above the smoke of a ruined world, the legend remained. No matter how heavy the flak, no matter how fierce the fire, the bombers kept coming.